Hello there, artsy friends. Today I'll be showing you how I made this breakfast flatlight illustration using Procreate. But first, I have a question for you. What is your favorite breakfast food in the morning? Mine are these food that you see on this illustration. And also, the sketch and the color palette will be linked down below and the brushes that I'm using. So let's start. Now that we have our sketch layer, we're going to go ahead and add our background color by adding a new layer and naming it background. We're going to color drop with the lightest color on the color palette. And we're going to start with the coffee element on this illustration. We're going to zoom in to our coffee element and use the light brown color for the plate. And we're going to use the salty ink brush from the texture pack, and I'm going to increase the brush size and draw a circle. And to draw a perfect circle, you're just gonna go ahead and tap and hold on your other finger to make a perfectly symmetrical circle. We can use the transform tool to move the circle around to fit where we sketch the plate. Next, we're gonna fill that in. And we're gonna add a new layer on top of the plate for the cup. And we're also going to name the layer plate so we're organized. And next, I'm going to use a off-white color for the cup. And I'm still going to use the salty ink brush for this process. And the same process, just go ahead and circle around the cup and fill that in with the salty ink brush. And again, you can always use the arrow tool to resize the element however you want. And we're going to go ahead and fill that cup. And next, we're going to rename it as cup. And we're going to add a new layer above that cup for the coffee itself. We're going to use that brown color and use the fluffy ink brush from the texture pack. You can always use any brush that you prefer. And obviously with the name of the brush, it has a very fluffy edge on its edges, and you can always use the arrow or transform tool to move it around and resize however you want. Next, we're going to go ahead and rename that coffee. And we're also going to paint the handle of the cup because I forgot to paint it. And we're going to group the layers to be named as coffee. Next, we're going to add a new layer above the coffee layer and rename that leaves. We're going to paint the leaves under one layer. And we're going to use that crunchy ink brush from the texture pack using a green color from the color palette. You can always streamline your brush by tapping it to avoid those wiggly lines. And so here I'm just tracing in the leaves from the sketch and filling that in with, again, the crunchy ink brush. Now that we're done filling in the leaves, I'm going to go ahead and start with the cookie using the salty ink brush and a flesh pink color from the color palette. And we're going to go ahead and fill that in. However, if you're unhappy about it, you can always use the arrow tool and make sure that you're on warp and move around what you've drawn on if you're not happy about the shape. Next, we're going to fill that in, and we're going to go ahead and rename that plate. Next, we're going to add a new layer above the plate for the cookie itself, and I'm going to rename it cookie. We're going to go ahead and tap on the brown color from the color palette and use the crunchy ink brush from the texture pack to fill the cookie in from our sketch. Next, we're going to go ahead and add a new layer above the cookie for the chocolate chip and tap the darkest brown color and fill that in from our sketch layer. Once we're done with the cookie, we're just going to go ahead and group that layer and rename it cookie. And next, I'm going to use the salty ink brush from the texture pack and add a new layer above those for the plate for the bacon and toast. Same technique, fill that in and circle it around. And next, as you can see, the leaves are below the plate, so we're just gonna move the leaves layer above the toast and the bacon layer. Next, we're gonna go ahead and fill the bacon with the pink color from the color palette. And I'm gonna use the crunchy ink brush for that. And we're gonna go ahead and fill that in. Next, I'm going to add a new layer above the bacon and tap clipping mask. We're gonna go ahead and choose a dark pink color and use the crunchy ink to color the top part of the other half part of the bacon. Next, add a new layer above the clipping mask layer for the bacon and tap a white color for that. And let's just go ahead and line the middle part of the bacon for details. Next, let's go ahead and add another layer for the toast and use the yellow brownish color for the toast layer. And using the crunchy ink, we're just gonna go ahead and fill that in with that color from the color palette. So this is a repetitive process of filling in your base layers before your details. So as you can see, I'm adding a new layer above that bread layer for the egg whites, and I'm using a white color for that. I'm going to use a crunchy ink brush for that while outlining and filling the egg white for the toast. And of course, I'm going to add another layer above that egg white for the yellow part of the egg. And we're going to go ahead and rename those layers just to be organized, And we're going to go ahead and use that yellow color and use the salty ink brush for that egg yolk. Next, I'm going to group those layers together under one group just so it's not too cluttery in our layers panel. So as you can see, I'm just repeating the process on these utensils for the spoon and the fork. I'm using a brownish flesh color for that, and I'm filling that in with the salty ink brush from the texture pack. I've fast forwarded this process and I'm renaming it utensils. And next, I'm going to, of course, add another layer for the menu, and it's going to be below the utensils just so the fork is above that menu paper. I'm going to use a flesh pink color for the menu, and I'm using a crunchy ink brush for that, and I'm filling that in using the flesh pink color, and I'm tapping and holding just so we could achieve that perfect line. You can freehand this or tap and hold for free for those perfect symmetrical lines, but it's up to you. I like to use the tap and hold feature of Procreate just so I could achieve those non-wiggly symmetrical line. Next, I'm going to fill in the phone using this color from the color palette, and I'm just filling that in for the corner or the edges of the phone. And next, I'm going to add another layer, but I'm going to move it below that phone layer, and using that same flesh color for the menu, I'm going to fill that in with the crunchy ink brush. Next, I'm going to use the cotton brush from the texture pack, and I'm going to use the same color from the coffee color and add a new layer above that coffee layer and tap clipping mask. I'm going to change the color mode to multiply and add the details of the coffee. Next, I'm going to add a new layer above that clipping mask layer and tap clipping mask. I'm going to use the dusty brush from the texture pack and use an off-white color from the color palette. I'm going to just sprinkle it in just for details, and next I'm going to decrease the opacity to at least 75%, And I'm also going to duplicate this layer just so it's more dark and decrease the opacity to at least 70%. Next, I'm going to add a new layer above the leaves for details, and I'm going to tap clipping mask for that. I'm going to use the grunge brush from the texture pack, and I'm going to use the dark green from the color palette. I'm just going to add some details on the half part of the leaves, like so. And I'm just going to do that on all the leaves on this layer. Next, moving on to the details for the cookie, I'm going to add another layer above the cookie layer, and I'm going to tap clipping mask again, and I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply. I'm going to use that same color on the cookie, and I'm going to just use the grunge brush from the texture pack and just add details on the outline of the cookie just so the edges are more dark, and we're just removing the flatness from the illustration. So I'm just varying my pressure for my Apple Pencil, because if you vary that pressure, it's going to give you a variation of texture from the grunge brush. So if you press harder, it's going to be more dark, and if it's you press lighter, it's going to be more light. Next, I'm going to add some details for the spoon and fork. I'm going to just use that same color for the spoon and fork and tap a new layer above that. I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply and use the dusty brush to dust some details for the spoon and fork, as you can see over here. Just so it doesn't look so flat and it has more texturally like feel. Next, I'm going to add a new layer on the bacon, and I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply. I'm going to use the grunge brush, and I'm going to use that same color to add some details and depth to the bacon. Over here, I'm going to add that on where it curves from the bottom. Next, since the details are too harsh, we're going to decrease the opacity to at least 50%. Next, I'm going to add details to the bread. I'm going to use the clipping mask again. I'm going to use the off-white color and use the grain shaker from the texture pack just to add some variation and lessen the flatness of the bread. Next, I'm going to add some details on the bread. I'm going to tap a new layer and tap clipping mask, and we're going to change the blend mode to multiply. Using that same color, we're going to use the grunge brush from the texture pack, and we're going to add some shadows and details to the toast, like so. Next, I'm going to decrease the opacity of the duplicated layer of this detail, the brown part, and I'm going to decrease it to until 50%. And of course, I'm going to merge it down. Next, we're not forgetting the yellow part of the egg. I'm going to use the grunge brush, and same color, same technique. We're going to add a new layer above the yellow part and tap the blend mode to multiply. And again, tapping it to make it a clipping mask layer. And add the details like so. Next, I'm going to merge those layers together and add another layer above that for the pepper detail. And I'm going to tap clipping mask and use this dark gray color on this one. And I'm going to use the dusty brush to mimic the pepper-like texture for this egg. Next, I'm going to add some details on the menu and add a new layer above that menu and make some handwritten lettering for this one. And I'm just going to scribble that menu details. Last but not the least, we're going to add some details over the phone, and you can use any detail that you want, and we're pretty much done. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and make sure to leave a comment down below for any feedback or suggestions that you want to see on this channel. So, see you on the next one.